few more, but it's 7:30, so we'll make a bit of a start of it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to the last of our Art of Faith talks. I think everyone's enjoyed them, or so far the feedback we've got has been very positive. So thank you all for coming to tonight and any of the other series. We hope you've enjoyed it. We very much enjoyed putting it on. Tonight's talk, the last in the series, is Buddhist and Hindu art. And as per usual, I know I say this every time, but as per usual with our faith series, I think we've really got some fantastic speakers for the whole series, and tonight is absolutely no different. So if you would please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Rycroft. Thank you.
Hi folks, it's a great pleasure to be here in Tunbridge Wells. Thank you so much for coming. So my name is Dan Rycroft. I work at the University of East Anglia. I'm a senior lecturer in art history and also anthropology, and I specialise in Indian art and the visual cultures associated with basically modern India. So today's talk is in anticipation of a Hindu festival called Holi, which is coming up in 2 days' time. So we're thinking of, to some extent, reflecting on this seasonal aspect. So many of the Hindu festivals are brought about kind of in time and space, given the lunar calendar and so on. So we're also trying to, I think about what it means to engage these issues at this present time. You can see the sprinkling of the colour. The Holi festival is premised on the exuberance of colour. So if we go on to the next slide, we can just see an image that I think brings something into our perception about how colour can work in and of itself, almost. So as the Holi festival is coming up, we need to also think about the kind of what it means to basically move from winter to spring with all that spring brings. So it's basically about regeneration, it's about anticipation, and in accordance with some Hindu beliefs, the Holi festival is also a time at which forgiveness can be offered to each other. Given that we are here at, in this place right now, it may be the first time that we're sort of having a public engagement today, and given the events of the morning, I think it's perhaps prescient just to kind of basically spend one or two moments reflecting on what it means to be together in a public space, in a safe space, and in a space in which we can develop ideas and develop our humanity. So, I'm coming at this really from the perspective of art history. I worked at the British Museum on graduation from the University of East Anglia. I worked for the British Council on an exhibition called The Enduring Image, which was the British Council's engagement with India at 50, so that was in 1997. And I worked at the British Museum on that touring exhibition, and I got that job given my sort of interest and engagement in the folk arts of India in the mid-90s. And since that exhibition, I've gone on, I graduated with a PhD from the University of Sussex and have been working at UEA since 2006. What we can do then is address the arts and cultures of Buddhism and Hinduism today. That's really what we're going to be thinking about. And we can, in a sense, tease out one or two themes. What we're trying to explore is how art, so the making of something, serves the religious purpose, either within Buddhism or within Hinduism. And what we're going to be also thinking about is then how particular art forms function according to their place within particular time and space. We're thinking about the regional identities within India, and we're thinking also about the cross-cultural exchange which perhaps sort of from the colonial period onwards, India has contributed to. So can we move on to the next one? I'm going to sort of touch on what is called the Bengal School of Art as an interesting departure point. We might think of the Buddhist and Hindu arts according to a very long sort of historical time frame, the time frame through which India's civilization kind of enters into our consciousness. But in starting with the Bengal school, we're also going to be thinking about specific histories. So the Bengal School of Art came up in the early 20th century as a response to the sort of aesthetic and intellectual colonization of India in the 19th century. And what we're interested in here, in exploring these kinds of images, is the sense that India's religious heritage became part and parcel of also India's modernity. So I think this is kind of an interesting point because it shows us that the Buddhist and Hindu artistic and spiritual traditions are kind of ongoing, have been ongoing, and developing in very interesting and important ways through the centuries. And that we can, given our proximity to the early 20th century, we can start to, in a sense, think about how certain cross-currents entered into the artistic consciousness of the Bengal school artists. So we have here works by, on the right, Abanindranath Tagore, in the middle, Devi Prasad Roy Chowdhury, and on the left, Kitin Majumdar. And they are brought together not only because they're all representative of the Bengal School of Art, but they demonstrate something about how the Bengal artists were positioning themselves as somehow aligned with or affiliated to the spiritual traditions within India. So on the right-hand side, we see a painting called Ashoka's Queen, which is part of the Vinay collection. In the middle, we see a painting called Lotus Pond, and then on the left, a painting called Jumuna, named after one of the Hindu deities. So there's an art historian called Geeta Kapoor, who's a contemporary art historian, who explores the term tradition in use. And it's this concept of tradition in use which I think we can dwell on as we explore one or two points concerning these images. What I'm trying to also do at this point is to think about Buddhist and Hindu art under one umbrella, rather than as separate religions. And there's a particular point in doing that, because it allows us to think about religious diversity and what religious diversity means in the context of modern India, rather than religious difference. Because religion has obviously been appropriated within the discourses of various kinds of nationalism and various kinds of communalism or sort of community-based identity politics. And when we're looking at Buddhist and Hindu art kind of under one umbrella, we're able to, I think, engage these kinds of paintings according to the value system that they were kind of brought about in the context of that. So the value system is one which is about, in this case, reasserting the intellectual and creative right of the Bengal school artists to, in a sense, speak these religions and these spiritual traditions on the terms that would be useful to themselves as exponents of a particular kind of cultural consciousness called Swadeshi. And that consciousness of Swadeshi is the consciousness of self-reliance, which meant a lot at the time, so the early 20th century. We're also using these images as a way to sort of think about this particular values that are brought into play as and when we're thinking about Buddhist and Hindu art in modernity. So let us just kind of think about that. On the right, the side of Ashoka's Queen basically is a portrait of the wife of Emperor Ashoka, who was the first Buddhist ruler in India. And so it's almost like a pictorial statement of the artist, Abanindranath Tagore, reclaiming that past and animating that past through the act of piety which comes in through the figure of the queen. In the central image, the lotus pond, we see not necessarily an act of piety, but a family scenario, and we're trying to, in a sense, address the significance of, in this case, the Santal family. And the Santal family is important because the Santals were one of the important indigenous, or what colonials called aboriginal communities in India. So rather than a kind of a specific emphasis on history, in the middle image there's a specific emphasis on social connectedness between Devi Prasad Roy Chowdhury as a modern artist, a Bengali artist, and the Santals, who were known as perhaps being slightly impoverished or slightly marginalised within the colonial system. And we see another image of a Santal woman here in the portrait of the goddess Jumna. And why this is interesting is because the artist, Majumdar, developed a sister portrait of the Hindu goddess Ganga, or the Ganges. And the Jumna as the river and the Ganges as another river converge at Allahabad. And so what we're, in a sense, getting then is the significance of the convergence of basically different streams of Indian society, the Santal embodying what was seen as sort of so-called primitive societies, and the Bengali girl embodying the more elite aspects of Hindu caste society. So the early castes, the early peoples, and the higher castes coming together under this one umbrella of Indian society. So this is telling us something about then how through the mythology of Ganga and Jumna, and through the riverine sort of convergence, we can understand the need to engage a kind of a sensitivity towards the notions and the values of, let's say, convergence or reconciliation. So we can move on. In thinking about Hindu art, we can then take forward an engagement with some of these values. Hinduism is premised on its relevance to Indian society, its relevance to society at large. And what it is really about is a philosophy of energy. And so what I'm showing you here is a series of images that all tell us something about the energy of Shakti, or power, which is an energy associated with the divine feminine in India. And so the central image at the hub of things is by Anish Kapoor. And what it is, in a sense, drawing us into is this concept of void. He's using colours associated with the Hindu mother goddess Kali, and kind of working with that to create an atmosphere in which we become contemplative of the almost kind of primal energies of the universe. What then we find in Hinduism is an expression of these kinds of energies through particular characters. So the mythologies associated with all this become quite prominent through various mythologies associated with particular deities. And what I'm showing you here are mythologies associated with the divine feminine. So there's other ways we could do this, but just in this slide they're all to do with the divine feminine. On the left we have an image of Mahakali, so the great mother goddess Kali. In Shiva's hair we see an image of the descent of the Ganga, the river and goddess Ganges. On the far right we see an image of the mother goddess Durga, who is a different manifestation of Kali, and like Kali also wife of the Hindu deity Shiva that you see in that image there. with one of her sons, Ganesh, and then in the right hand one, inner one, another image of Durga. So what we're in a sense trying to tap into as well is an understanding of Hinduism existing at different levels within Hindu society. So what that means is you have what is called the great and the little traditions, and Hinduism incorporating these different aspects through the ways in which the mythologies and the rituals associated with the divine feminine and all these other divine entities become sort of codified and perpetuated through various knowledges and various social and spiritual and religious practices. So let's just dwell on the image of Durga. You see that she is riding a lion, that she's incredibly powerful because she is defeating one of the big demons called Mahishasura. And you see she has the 8 arms, she's carrying weapons that have been given to her by all the other deities as a way to defeat this big sort of monstrosity. So a lot of what goes on within Hindu myth is about the kind of vanquishing of evil. And so Durga, her name means the unvanquished, the one who cannot ever be defeated. Okay, let's move on. What I find very interesting then is how some of these myths, some of the ritual arts associated with Hindu myth enter into our sort of cultural understanding as museum goers. So within, or kind of from the colonial period onwards, the concept of Hindu sculpture became one which a lot of Western museums wanted to buy into. And so we see a lot of ancient Hindu sculpture in Western museums. And there's a certain cultural politics around that as well, which is about the West, or in some cases Britain, appropriating for the benefit of not only itself but other viewers and museum goers, the religious arts of India, and translating them into discourses of art rather than of religion. But what we find sort of more recently is that there's more sensitivity towards re-establishing contact between what are called source communities and the museum goers and the curators who are interested in preserving the arts and cultures within their collections. And so in 2006 there was a very interesting sort of intervention in the British Museum in the Great Court, which was built, as you know, for the millennium. In terms of the Voices of Bengal, this overall season of exhibitions associated with Bengal, which is in eastern India. And the centerpiece of that was the creation of this Durga pandal, or this you could call it a murti, or an image of the divine feminine, the Mother Durga, by 3 artisans who had been sort of brought into London with the assistance of the Crafts Council of Bengal to make this image. And it presents, I think, very interesting questions, which are about to what extent we as visitors to the museum see this as religious art, or the extent that we see it as a manifestation of some kind of sort of cultural identity that's premised on the survival and growth of the artisans of India and their output. Because in the one instance, this is a manifestation of a sort of a cultural tradition. In the other instance, it's the installation of a goddess. And there are then different ways to approach this. And I think museums now are quite interested in maintaining some of this ambivalence. So to think of museums not only as sites at which art is preserved and displayed, but also sites at which culture continues, and continues in ways that are perhaps empowering for different communities. So one of the things that's very interesting about this then is the focus on the artisan. And there's a very long and interesting history in terms of the colonial reception of these artisanal works from India. Because it's these artisans who are seen to be embodiments of this long-standing tradition. In order to make an image like this, you need to have a particular knowledge of the Shilpa Shastras, so the texts that all of the image makers would adhere to in order to define the correct iconography of these deities. There'd be a certain set of conventions around the kinds of materials that could be used, and also a certain set of conventions about how to make the objects in such a way that they're not purely objects, but they are manifestations of this Shakti, of this earth force. So what you see under construction here is the conflict between Durga and the great demon, and eventually she's surrounded by her family. And I'm showing you a scene in which the artist is developing the eye, because it's not the finishing of the scene where the eye is sort of brought, where the painting of the eye is the moment at which the sort of the spirit of the deity occupies the image. I'm showing you the attention just so that we can think about what that moment was. I haven't got a photograph of that. And it's very important to understand the role of the eye in terms of the kind of communication that is enabled between the Hindu deity or the murti or the image and the viewer. Because if you're accessing this as a pilgrim or as a devotee, you would be looking at the deity in the way that you're also then accepting the gaze of the deity into your own spirit as well. So it's a very powerful kind of mutual exchange of sight called darshan. So what we've done up to this point is think kind of in general terms about some of the precepts that underpin the making of Hindu art. What we're going to do in the next little section is to think about some of the concepts and precepts that underpin Buddhism and Buddhist art. And what we see here is a structure called a stupa in the middle. A stupa is a burial mound which encases the relics of the Buddha. And this stupa is at a place in central India called Sanchi, and it is a World Heritage Site. What we're interested in doing, I think, in this phase is just addressing some of the principles that animate this stupa structure as a site at which people can, in a sense, learn a bit about Buddha, what his teachings were, why they might be relevant to them. So whereas earlier on we were thinking about the artisans of India whose work has been going on over centuries, what we're looking at here is a historic structure that's about 2,000 years old. Buddha himself was a historical figure. He's known for having attained enlightenment and having then generated through this sort of insight or whole series of philosophical and spiritual insights a way of being, and he developed that way of being in communication with his followers, who then took the whole set of teachings forward so that they could become social. Why, though, is it relevant for the relics of the Buddha to become sites of pilgrimage? Well, in response to that question, we can think then about what happens at the stupa. what happens is a pilgrim would enter through one of the 4 gateways, which are orientated according to the cardinal points, circumambulate the stupa at 2 levels, first at ground level and then higher up on the upper level. What they're doing in circumambulating, so you can see on the plan, I've shown you a plan, both the side-on view and the top-down view. If you look at the top-down view, you can see the geometry is very circular, almost wheel-like. And in circumambulating within this sort of sacred space, within the railings, the pilgrim is in fact turning the stupa in a way that can be thought about as a parallel with the Buddha turning what was called the wheel of law. Having attained enlightenment, the Buddha generated a whole set of teachings. And the first of those was at a place called Sana, where the turning of the wheel of Dharma, or the correct way of sort of thinking and being, that was also developed by Buddha at that time. And so in being there in the proximity to the stupa, the pilgrims are continuing the teachings of the Buddha. So it's quite interesting then how that concept becomes architectural. So it becomes architectural not only through the mound, which is some people see as being almost like a form of a Buddha in meditation, but also through the synergies between the artistic and architectural elements. And the gateways, the railings are all covered with stories from the life of the Buddha, not only his human life, but also his earlier human lives and also his earlier animal lives. Because one of the things that's sort of coming into play here is this concept of nirvana, of Buddha having developed enough insight into the human condition in order to free himself from what is basically referred to, not only in Buddhism but also in Hinduism, in terms of the cycle of death and rebirth that all living beings, whether human or non-human, are sort of attached to, given their nature. He developed, through becoming enlightened, a way to confront and engage the sort of limitations therein. And he taught people about how to develop enough sort of wisdom and compassion and so forth, in an effort to, in a sense, bring about an understanding of the inevitable lack of progress that would sort of impede the human development if these questions weren't addressed. So he, in a sense, brought about a whole kind of change in thinking. He was very significant in terms of the history of India's religions. So I just wanted to touch on one or two points therein. So in the structure we see the use of certain symbols, you could say, to represent different times in the life of the Buddha. So the footprints are shown to show you where he's been walking and where he's sort of touched the earth, and other symbols are shown to show his meditative state, his state as an enlightened being, and the stupa is shown also as representative of the nirvana, the departure of not only the Buddha from the sort of realm of the living, but the whole kind of Buddha soul from the whole of existence. That's a sort of a big concept, but nonetheless that's the concept that's being articulated through this architecture. So let's go on. There are then certain interpretative questions that come into the art historical framework when we're thinking about the time frames that accompany these kinds of art objects. So we talked a bit about the Sanchi stupa. There was another stupa built a couple of centuries after Sanchi at a place in southern India called Amaravati. And a lot of the Amaravati stupa has been acquisitioned by the British Museum, and you can see it at one end of the Houghton Gallery in the Amaravati Gallery, and you see that gallery, in fact, in all of these images. One thing that I wanted to touch on was the significance of the representation of the stupa on the stupa. So you don't get this too much at Sanchi, but you get it a lot in the Amaravati stupa, which you see in the top image. On the drum face, the pilgrims, as and when they circumambulate, would be near to not only the stupa as an element in and of itself, but the representations of the stupa. Asking the question, is the pilgrim then witness to this passing of the Buddha, so the moment of nirvana only, or are they also witness to this closer sort of engagement between themselves as pilgrims and as visitors, and the, in a sense, nitty-gritty of the things being expressed in terms of this shared human reality? Because if we're learning from Sanchi about the use of these kinds of symbols, they're being carried forward at Amaravati in a way that people would have been able to have understood. One of the interesting things about this image in the middle is that it shows the human version of the Buddha in one of the earliest times. So we then get the question as to what in fact is the pilgrim kind of being asked to ponder or to engage? Is it the act of being there as a sort of a human, like the Buddha was, in a kind of proximity to this stupa, or is there another sort of message being conveyed about the sort of the architectural fabric of Buddhism, because there was an intense effort made to make his teachings accessible, and just by being kind of in a relationship or in a shared presence with the architecture, it was understood that one of the three jewels of Buddhism would be animated. So the three jewels of Buddhism are his teachings, himself, and his followers. So, in a sense, the followers, or the monks and nuns, were the ones who would preserve the stupa as a site of pilgrimage, and it's the teachings which come across in visual form, because we're getting a sense of, through the images like this one here in the middle, we're getting a sense of the significance of being near the relics as a way to apprehend all these concepts pertaining to nirvana. Let's have another slide. So what I'm going to do now, having gone through these points about Hinduism and Buddhism, is just to explore some of these points in slightly more sort of historical historical detail. So I mentioned earlier on Emperor Ashoka. He was around a couple of centuries before the Common Era and converted to Buddhism. So if we're referring back to the earlier painting of Ashoka's queen, we're also able to then understand the significance of this Buddhist artistic and architectural heritage to people not only in Ashoka's time, but also in Abanindranath Tagore's time as well. So Ashoka was the leader who made Buddha's teachings known initially by inscribing them on these pillars. And there were similar pillars like this at Sanchi. And what they're basically saying is that Buddha's message is universal. It's conveyed through the roar of the lion. And it's also quite interesting that some of these Ashokan pillars also had the Weir of Law mounted on the top as well. And so there was then this kind of construction of a geography in and through the architecture and the workings of these monumental pieces within Ashoka's empire. And without Ashoka's intervention, there really wouldn't be the architectural and religious heritage associated with Buddhism in the way that we know it, because through all this it then also extended into other parts of Asia and also other parts of the world. And one of kind of the key points around Buddha was that he was very critical of the sort of esoteric nature of Hinduism as it was at the time. And one of his sort of points was to make religious beliefs and religious practices more accessible to people, regardless of their place in society. So he was, in a sense, a very liberal, free thinker, and a bit of a rebel, despite being brought up within an aristocratic framework initially. And interestingly, then, that intervention brought about changes within Hinduism as well. So the exponents of Hinduism wanted their beliefs also later on, so through the first millennium, to be as accessible as Buddha's had become. And we see then the rise of a new kind of Hinduism, which is called bhakti, or devotional Hinduism. And it's this kind of Hinduism which is expressed through temples such as the one that we see here at the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram. So we have evidence through the development of Hindu temple architecture, both in the southern tradition, as the one that you see here, and also in the northern tradition, of devotional Hinduism, at which the precepts underpinning the existence of the divine could be sort of experienced by being in the temple as a space of worship, because not only the image of the specific deities inside the temples, but also the temples themselves are basically seen as the deity, so not separate from the deity. And they obviously also, given their relationship to particular kinds of power and kingdoms and so on, you then have a quite interesting religious or sacred geography emerging, not only through them being built, but also through their use. And through that, then, also certain kinds of regional identities being produced and performed. So it's a very kind of long, complex religious and architectural civilization under consideration here, but what I want to show you through the image on the right of Mother India is that a lot of these ideas infiltrate into the modern and contemporary consciousness of many Hindus, whether they are living in India or elsewhere, to the extent that the whole kind of area of India, Bharat, is also seen now in some, according to some worldviews, as a deity in herself. And it's also quite interesting then to probe the implications of some of these concepts as well, some of these ideas as they're perpetuated by religious institutions and even certain kinds of political institutions. Because within modern India we see, even sort of 70 years after the end of colonialism, a lot of what is called identity politics, so different castes, different regions, different sects, different linguistic communities and so on, all asserting their right to exist and also in some ways coexist depending on their levels of tolerance. I'm showing you one or two things which may be of interest. On the left, I'm showing you a slide of one of the other indigenous, or what is called Adivasi communities. So earlier on we saw images of the Santals, this image is of the what are called Chaudhry Adivasis in Gujarat, to highlight then that some of these Adivasi or indigenous peoples also adhere to some aspects of Hinduism, even though historically they have been rather separate a lot of the time from the dominant caste and dominant sects. What we see in the middle is an image that tells us a bit about how and why Hinduism is seen to be a universal religion. So what we're seeing in the middle image here is an image of what is called Purusa. So Purusa is this what is called cosmic being, because within the Hindu belief system, the deities were thought to have actually been living entities on the same earth that we now inhabit, but just almost like in a totally different time and almost like a different world. So in order to kind of bridge this gap, there is this concept of Purusa as the cosmic being, this kind of, not a real human, but a cosmic human who sort of touches on all of the elements of the cosmos. So all of the planets, all of the stars, all of the space, all of the space-time, all of the world, all of the livingness of the world, all of humanity and so on. And it's this concept of Purusa as being an entity that could be sort of condensed into the space of the sacred, which we find to be kind of one of the animating or kind of activating principles of Hindu architecture. So in order for any temple to actually function as a temple, the priests must kind of sketch out, either in an imaginary or in a real form, what is called a Purusa Mandala, and thereby to kind of hone all of that according to that very site at which the temple is being developed, in such a way that the temple itself can be a manifestation of this cosmic being or this cosmic force. So the kind of grid that we see here is called the Vastu Purusa Mandala. So the translation of the Purusa, or the cosmic being, in this kind of grid system, but then also as a way to allow the Vastu, or the form, the architectural form, to develop in accordance with these principles. I'm showing you on the right another image which may be of interest, because it's called the Matri Mandir, or the Mandir or temple for the mother goddess, as it has been thought about by the philosopher Sri Aurobindo, who's a modern philosopher, and also by his followers. So this is in South India, near a place called Pondicherry. And I'm basically showing it to you because it's an expression of similar kinds of ideas, but in accordance with the thinking of this one person, Sri Aurobindo, who was a universalist, kind of idealist philosopher of the early 20th century. So to show you then that some of these ideas can materialize in ways that are non-conventional. So this is a non-conventional expression of something that is essentially aligned with kind of Hindu philosophy and sort of traditional Hindu precepts, but which, through the mind and life of Sri Aurobindo as somebody expounding integral yoga, it becomes something different, it becomes something modern. So in the last few slides, I wanted to address some other points. Sri Aurobindo was a philosopher who sought to reconcile the divergences of what was thought of as Western philosophy and what was thought of as Eastern philosophy. So, you know, in the beginning, I talked about convergence, I talked about reconciliation. In his own practice as a philosopher, as a writer, as a yogic, as a social scientist, as a political activist at certain points in time, Sri Aurobindo sought to synthesize the divergent worldviews of what was thought about in terms of East and West. And so then, in that life and in all of his writings, he's well known for writing a very kind of challenging text called The Life Divine. You see, through his articulation, the need for synthesis at the universal level as a way to escape the dichotomies brought about by various kinds of nationalist thinking or various kinds of colonialist thinking. So a kind of universalism emerges through his philosophy. And just by highlighting this image of the Great Court in the British Museum, I'm sort of trying to anticipate ways in which we can broach this idea of universalism afresh, because the British Museum presents itself as a universal museum, as a museum which kind of is an umbrella for all civilizations. And if we kind of think back to the earlier architecture associated with the mother, according to Sri Aurobindo, we can see then that there are multiple sort of universalisms that exist that aren't necessarily ones which might find an easy accommodation in all of the different sections and departments of the British Museum. So, by using this phrase, new museums in India, I'm also highlighting the history of different kinds of museums within India, because the faith and religious aspects come about, well, they initially came about according to what you might think of as sort of colonial principles. And here you see the Indian Museum very much the architectural product of colonialism in Calcutta. But nowadays what's inside it as being representative of post-colonial rather than colonial thinking. But then within India, there's also a move towards greater sensitivity to all of these minority cultural traditions, minority heritages, minority religions even, in a way that confirms some of the principles and values as they were articulated by the likes of Mahatma Gandhi and other leaders in the 20th century. And so I'm showing you on the right-hand slide an image from a place in Bhopal in central India called the National Museum of Mankind. And very interestingly, this concept of the Museum of Mankind has been brought into central India. It's been internalized by the government and the intellectuals in India, to the extent that they have also then used it as a way to define their own minority civilizations and minority communities. And what that then entails is, in various kind of sites around the museum, the display of these indigenous and tribal architectural and cultural heritages in the way that you see here exemplified. This is a typical piece of domestic architecture from the Bhumij community. So it's quite interesting then, because within this sort of architecture, you also see an expression of the worldviews of each of these minority, indigenous or tribal peoples. And it's these Adivasi or indigenous or tribal peoples whose cultural heritage was once the preserve of kind of colonial and later also national anthropologists, and is now the preserve of people who align themselves as descendants of some of these earliest inhabitants of India. It's also the preserve of certain curators who have anthropological collections and so on. And in 2012, I was involved in a project which attempted to engage some representatives of some of the Adivasi people. So this whole project, Through the Eye of the Ancestors, was about what is called the visual repatriation of some anthropological photographs, in a sense taken in the first half of the 20th century and brought back into circulation through the work of indigenous or Adivasi curators. And so I show you an image on the left, which is from the same National Museum of Mankind. This is one of the Bhil Adivasi houses, because it was the Bhil Adivasi community who were central in making this visual repatriation work happen. And what it meant was that the European collectors and curators, so representatives of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, representatives of the Grassi Museum for Völkerkunde in Leipzig, would team up with cultural activists in Gujarat and representatives of what is called the museum, the Adivasi Museum of Voice, to generate the opportunity for this new engagement with previously unshown anthropological photographs. So photographs that have remained archival, that tell kind of us as anthropologists and everybody else, as community actors, about the beliefs of the ancestors, a few generations back. And so it's a very interesting process, because the Museum of Voice curators then brought some of the photos not only into the sort of cultural landscape through exhibition, which is what you see here, but also through a whole kind of ritual process of bringing these into 4 different homes as kind of ancestral entities. So here's a further kind of exploration of this more minority belief system. I mentioned to 1 or 2 members of the audience that I had worked at the British Museum, and one of the reasons why I sort of got that job in the 90s was that I had done some collecting work, and you see on the right-hand side 2 painted scrolls which I had collected for the British Museum, which show the creation myth of the Santal Adivasis and their belief systems. And I'm highlighting this really as a way to sort of show that the collections aren't just premised on the dominant religions, but they also incorporate some of these minority beliefs. And if you just wanted to kind of look at some of these images, you can see various scenes from the creation myth of the Santals. You have the creation of the earth at the top, which isn't actually included in this slide, and then you have various episodes from the history of the Santal people in terms of the weddings and the generation of the 7 families or clans, and then typical kind of episodes from the life of the Santals on the right-hand side, culminating in the funerary rituals and the role here of the scroll painter, who would take the scrolls back to the families, or back to kind of the family of any deceased member, and paint in the eyes on just a single portrait like this to provide the reassurance to the family that their deceased family member would be able to see in the afterlife. I mean, this is the belief system. And so it's quite interesting, because the scroll painter is showing himself here not just as a painter, but as somebody sitting on the throne of the what is called Jomraja, or the kind of ruler of the afterlife. So there's a very interesting kind of alignment there. And with that would come various gifts. And I'm showing you this image on the left, which is not from the Santal community, but from another indigenous community called the Walis in Western India, to show you that some of their art has become really very central to this whole sort of artistic cultural heritage in contemporary India. You see a lot of this kind of work now in different formats. This isn't in fact a creation myth, but it's one of the key episodes from the sort of the history of the Walis, to do with how at one point in time they negotiated the famine scenario. This is an image from what is called the Mythological Trail, which is closely aligned with that Museum of Mankind that I referred to earlier. So it's got 2 more slides. This penultimate slide shows us some of the other ways in which some of these sort of faith-based philosophies came into play in modern India. So we see here Rabindranath Tagore, the uncle of the artist Abanindranath Tagore, whose work I showed you earlier, who was a philosopher, a bit like Sri Aurobindo, but somebody who was very involved in bringing about a kind of a new synthesis between sort of knowledge, society, and progress, in terms of a progress which wouldn't be detrimental to the future generations of India in a way that people were thinking colonialism was. And so Rabindranath Tagore set up a whole educational campus outside of Calcutta at a place called Shantiniketan, the abode of peace, in the sort of first couple of decades of the 20th century. And following on from the Bengal school, the artists who sort of moved there to become exponents of this living philosophy generated an incredible sort of mural tradition. Their interest in the murals of India led them to make their own murals, and one of the artists, Binod Bihari Mukherjee, painted this image in what is called the Hindi House or Hindi Bhavan in the 1940s, so just in the lead up to national independence, as a way to kind of express the ongoing relevance of some of the earlier philosophers who were very, very socially engaged, such as this one here, Kabir. And one of the other artists, so this mural, this one was painted by an artist called Binod Bihari Mukherjee, but one of his artistic colleagues, Nandalal Bose, was very closely affiliated to the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, and you can see his interest in this father figure shown here on what was called his Salt March, so his protest against the colonial salt tax in the early 1930s, and this became a very sort of iconic image of Mahatma Gandhi. And why I'm kind of showing you this in the context of this discussion around sort of Hindu and Buddhist art and so on, is that Gandhi, as well as being a kind of political activist, was also considered a holy man. He was somebody very, very attentive to cultivating a certain kind of body politic, a certain way of kind of being, dressing, making, thinking and acting that was in concordance with the values of village India. And so the artwork then that kind of came up at this time fed off Gandhi's philosophy, which itself learned from this earlier philosophy of Swadeshi, or self-reliance, that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. So in the final slide, I want to show how we could start to think then about some of the complex kind of time frames associated with this heritage work that was going on through reference to India's religious traditions. We return to another image of Abanindranath Tagore, Bharat Mata, or Mother India, from 1905. This was at the time of the earlier Swadeshi movement, where you see in the iconography of this young Bengali woman everything that Bengal needed to survive. So the attributes there show her with cloth, with the scroll of wisdom, with the paddy showing natural abundance, with the prayer beads and so on, showing you the sort of spiritual insights and so on, in an icon which borrows from Hinduism in as much as referring to the divine feminine, but is actually transplanted into a specific socio-political reality. And then on the left, I'm showing you another work by somebody else from the Bengal school called Upendra Maharati, who depicted the freedom fighter from the end of the 19th century called Birsa, who was a member of the Munda Adivasi. So I've taught you a little bit about some of the indigenous and tribal communities. The Mundas are one of these, and what's interesting about him is he started off life as a kind of a prophet. He died as a rebel, imprisoned in 1900. But by the 1930s, his memory had been sort of brought back into the national consciousness, and he became almost sort of deified. So he was known to his followers as Birsa Bhagwan, as in Lord Birsa. So Bhagwan means Lord. And it's very interesting how, so many years after his demise, he sort of becomes remembered as this divine figure, as somebody able to kind of show the way towards a certain kind of social justice. And people now refer to Birsa as the Gandhi before Gandhi because of his commitment to those kinds of freedoms. So in showing you these two portraits, I'm trying to get us also to think about the relevance of time and how, both through the invocation of the Mother India and the invocation of this figure, we can sort of anticipate ourselves kind of on the cusp of something. And this was a very important notion in the pre-independence phase. And so what we're then left with then is an image from Calcutta. It's called Kumatoli, so it's the place where a lot of the potters make the clay images of the Saraswati goddess, of the Durga goddess, and so on. And to me it's a very evocative image because it tells us something about that which is kind of coming out, that which is emergent from the earth, from the soil of Bengal in this case. And so you see all these Durga images kind of in the making, in the process of becoming. And thinking back to that earlier image that I showed you of the Mother Goddess Durga in the case of the British Museum, it's very important to consider what actually happens to these images. Yeah? So in the case of the British Museum one, it was very interesting because it involved the Bengali community in London, and there was the ritual immersion of the Durga goddess in the River Thames, just as these ones would be immersed in the Hooghly. So let us kind of leave the discussion at this point where we're thinking about kind of what happens to these kinds of faith-based images as and when they're brought into play in different contexts, whether it be a social or a museum context. Thank you.